Mark Hylkema is the Santa Cruz District Cultural Resource Program Manager for the California State Parks. And we are Coastside is part of Santa Cruz State District. So he's our guy. He has directed excavations throughout the greater San Francisco and Monterey Bay areas and works part-time as an adjunct professor of anthropology at Foothill College. He's also taught, and here comes the list, Mark. It feels like I've said this before. Anthropology, archaeology, and Native American studies classes at Santa Clara University, University of California, Santa Cruz, De Anza College, Ohlone College, and Cabrillo College. And I am beyond delighted to introduce to you Mark Hylkema.
Okay, first thing I want to say is I don't set myself up to be an entertainer. So you're with me on the ride here. Okay, second thing I want to say is we're in the homeland of the Siwan tribe and of the Ramay-speaking people, Ramaytush-speaking folks of the San Francisco Peninsula. And we like to acknowledge nowadays the ancestral connections of people then and today. And I'd also like to introduce my friend Kata, who didn't know I was going to do that. She is of the local Ramay tradition. So I'm very happy that she's come to check it out. Okay, I'm not Native American, but I have been working with Native American tribes and people for much of my life and have become very involved, particularly with the local folks we collectively call the Ohlone people. I've worked with many of the descendant families and communities most of my life, and in so doing I've been able to learn a great deal about ancestral traditions. And so I am speaking to share what I've learned over the years because it's a knowledge that needs to be spread to many different people so that we can all have an understanding of where we live and put ourselves in a context with the place and the time, and the histories that we have in this area. So my talk is going to be, well, quick by my standards, maybe not so quick for you, because I have a lot of slides to show to keep me on track. I don't have a script. So I know a lot of things I'm going to share. But let's understand that in an hour or an hour and a half or whatever it takes, you can't possibly portray the entirety of a people or culture. So what I'm going to do is pick items and topics that I think will help you to understand better the traditions we're speaking about. But understand that there's a lot more to know, than what I can cover in the time I have. So I've spent much of my life learning about Native American traditions, particularly California tribal traditions. Been very fortunate to have spent a lot of time with Lakota people. Yeah, that's interesting. Sioux, the Sioux Nation. There are a lot of Lakotas in the San Francisco Bay Area because they were relocated there by the U.S. government in the 1950s and 60s when they couldn't find jobs on the reservations and so forth. And they ended up in urban communities such as San Jose, Oakland, Los Angeles, New York, and began to have very difficult acculturation processes. And I was fortunate enough in my younger life to become a partner with a family, the Standing Out family, who nurtured me because they had a son my age named Terry, who was kind of getting in trouble with the cops on the east side of San Jose. And I was, longer haired then than I am now. And so it's very traditional for Lakota people to pair their young men together. And anthropologists have words for things like that, like a sodality. I won't use those words because it was more personal. So I got paired with another Lakota friend, and his father was a Wishashawakan, that means a holy man. And so I went through ritual with his son because his son had to go through them. So I was very fortunate to learn to speak some Lakota, enough to get me in trouble or out of trouble. And I've been to the Sweats, the Inipi, I've been to Sundance, I've been to Vision Quest, Amblasia. And I think it was those experiences that helped guide me to where I am so that I could speak to you now. And those experiences included my time at university going, what the hell am I going to do now? And fell into anthropology, which is even more distressed as far as a career track. But it's been a golden path. And so that's my preamble to say I have some authority to speak on the subject through experience. Because many Native people don't really care to have non-Native people, or archeologists in particular, highlight their cultures or try and reinterpret them for others. So I do so because of the experience I have, and I want to be clear on that. Okay. So with that, I'm going to be speaking about ancestral Native American lifeways. The people are still here. I think that's one of the fundamental concerns I hear from my friends in the Ohlone community, is that people don't recognize that they're still here. And as some of the elders once said to me, is that, we didn't disappear, you became many. And that's exactly right. Society has grown, enormously around us over the past few years. And that has masked the traditional, people that have been here all along. So I'm not going to speak about the people today. That's for them to say. They have websites. You can look up the Hylkema Ohlone or Ama Mutsun Ohlone tribe, or Indian Canyon, or the Musiate, and they have a website for the Ramai too. So you can learn from the people about how they are today. So what I'm speaking about is the past. This is a historical society, so we'll look into the history. And one of the things we do in archaeology is we come up with language that sometimes can be offensive to other people too. It's not the intent, but it can be. So we use words like prehistory or prehistoric. And for many Native people, it conjures up the image of no history. And that isn't the case here. What we have is different histories. History is produced by written word, about events and people. We don't have those writings or understandings of the people, before European contact, when writing was happening. There is history and prehistory. But the histories we talk about in the before European contact is the archaeological history. And rather than using people or events to highlight changes through time and create a timeline, archaeologists look at artifacts and radiocarbon dates. So you get, two different kind of trajectories of interpreting the past. So I'm going to try and merge the two in this talk, which I better get going on. So I think today, for us, in the busy world we live in, especially trying to get here from where I live in Sunnyvale, we lose contact, we lose touch, we lose the understanding of Native California, both the land and the people. We're so busy we don't see it, and yet it's still around. There are still many of the traditional landscapes that are around us if we have the eyes to see them. Old oak trees, and even in my neighborhood, there are still old oak trees that predate the contact of anybody, of Europeans being here. These trees are old enough in these urban landscapes to have seen Native people harvesting acorns under them. Because we're not talking about very, very distant times. It's not that long ago, is what I'm trying to portray. So we don't see that past. It blends into our busy world, but exists nonetheless. We don't have a lot of the stories that were told around the campfires here because of the intrusion of the mission system. And we had the Mexican period after the Spanish period. Then we have the early American period. All of these historical periods had effects on the Native people. And suffice to say that the oppression that did occur was enough to make it difficult for any of the stories and languages to persist, to continue. The people today are working to rediscover many of those things.
Ironically, through the anthropological record.
We don't have a lot of the stories of the Native people because they were suppressed, but we do have a couple. And just as an example, people tell stories to create understandings of the world around them. And a lot of stories are told through metaphor, through symbols. And around here, we have one story I'll relate to you, but it's an abridged version because sometimes these could last for days, if not, for long periods of time around a campfire. one story I really enjoy comes from actually from Mission Santa Cruz, and it's the story of First People. And the way the story goes is there was a time in the cosmic time when there was nothing but a great empty sphere of eternity with a single island of land in the middle of an ocean, and that island was where three spirit beings lived. One was eagle, and the other is coyote, and the third is hummingbird. In the Santa Cruz language, the word for hummingbird is umun, and there is a mountain that overlooks Monterey Bay and Santa Clara Valley that's still called Umunum today, and it means hummingbird place. It's one of the few features of our lands that still retains the native name. And so hummingbird, coyote, and eagle are on this island in the eternal sea. And hummingbird is the symbol of trust and innocence, whereas coyote is intelligence, smartness, but also conceit, importance, bragging, those kinds of behaviors come from coyote. Coyote is always referred to as the trickster in many native Californian stories, but through the trickster there are teachings and things to learn. An eagle, or se'ir in the language, was a messenger to another place beyond, to where the Great Spirit lived. When people of Half Moon Bay would pray, they would pray with tobacco to Esmen, the sun, and they recognized that there was a greater being beyond. They don't have names for that. We have words like God, but they put it in another realm of something bigger that can't be named. And so eagle is the messenger between the mundane world of coyote and hummingbird, good and evil, if you will, and the greater spirit beyond. So there they are in this eternal sea with hummingbird, nag, and coyote about proper behavior and whatnot. And then one day they notice the sea is receding, it's going away. And soon they realize they're on top of a mountain, and they're looking down, and they see world makers creating trees and rivers, and things are popping up here and there. And they're looking down from their platform on a mountain, maybe Umunum, right? And hummingbird tells coyote, why don't you go down the mountain and take inventory and see what you see? And so coyote goes, okay. He heads down the mountain, starts looking around, and notices trees, fish, birds, all of the creatures that there are. But there's one creature that vexes him, and he goes back to report to hummingbird what he has seen. And he says, there was one creature I couldn't figure out. It walked on two legs. And hummingbird in his infinite wisdom says, well, that is a woman, and that is to be your wife. And so coyote marries this first woman, and their children spread out and become the various tribes over the landscape. And so this is a creation story. And if it seems a little hard to track, try reading Genesis sometime. That could be kind of hard to track, too. People popping in when there's nobody before. What? So again, these are stories that speak to beginnings around campfires or whatnot. Many stories that we will never know. I like the story of Hummingbird and how Hummingbird got the red chest. That happened when after First People were created, they were poor. They were walking around shivering with no clothes on. They couldn't eat. And so Hummingbird said, that's very sad. So he holds a council. And what I like about California mythologies, councils will have trees present. Mountains can be there. They all have personalities, and they all have a voice. So they're all at this council, and Hummingbird's making a pitch for people. And they say, if they had fire, they could cook their food, and that would be a lot better. And everybody goes, okay, and you know how things like that work. When you have a brilliant idea with a committee, you get to carry it out. And so they nominate Hummingbird to be the ambassador to go find fire, because the only creatures that have fire are badgers. Badger people live in the ground, and they're kind of stingy. If you think about badgers, you don't want to be sticking your hand down a badger hole. It's not a good idea. So at any rate, Hummingbird flies over to Badger's lodge, and Badger sees Hummingbird come, and as is native California tradition, you feed your guests first thing. I've been to a lot of gatherings where before I could say boo, you get a food. You don't always get to pick what's on the plate, as I'll show you some pictures of. But nonetheless, there's food. And so Badger does the same for Hummingbird, starts feeding Hummingbird and going through the etiquette. Finally, Hummingbird gets around to saying, hey, how about if I grab one of those coals to give to those people? And Badger says, no. Okay, so Hummingbird splits. He comes back again, because like all good stories, you have this repeat performance, right? I'll skip ahead. By the third or fourth time, Hummingbird tries again. This time, Badger's had enough, and he throws a deer skin over the fire to hide it. So Hummingbird comes in, you know, hey, how about that fire? And I don't have any fire. And so then Hummingbird goes, oh, look over there. And so what he notices is that there's an arrow hole in the hide, in the deer hide, and he can see the fire underneath it. So he goes, look over there. So Mr. Trust and Innocence now dives in with his long beaks, steals the ember, tucks it under his chin, and splits. So he's just stolen fire. And, you know, that's why he's got a red chin, you know, because he stole fire. Of course, I don't know the story for the green hummingbird chins, but, you know, I got that one. So in California, there were many, many cultures here. California had the highest or the greatest population density of gathering, hunting peoples in North America. How many of you knew that? I mean, most of us are unaware of those kinds of realities. It was a very densely populated landscape, and it's because we have such a diversity of environments here, from alpine to desert to valley floor, oak woodlands, to mountains, to redwood forests, to marshes and lakes. It's pretty diverse. So the food is diverse as well as the climate, and thus so are the people. California has seen multiple migrations of people in and out. It's very much like today, where you have lots of people coming and going, so that it created a very complex mosaic of languages. California was one of the world's great linguistic mosaics. There are more languages spoken here than in most places on the planet. That makes it very difficult for people today to find their tribal identities using languages as a route for identity. And so it becomes complicated. This is a map of language families that many people have misassumed are called tribes. These are not tribes, they're languages. And so many of you may have heard of the Ohlone, say, for the San Francisco and Monterey Bay Area. Well, the word Ohlone was created actually around the 1960s when one of the descendants from Mission San Jose published and said, we don't want to be called the Costanoans, which is what the anthropologists were calling the local people. Said, we want to be called the Ohlone. It means people of the West. We know, too, that of the many tribes of the peninsula, one tribe at San Gregorio was called the Ohlone people, one of 50 tribal governments of the Monterey and San Francisco Bay Area. 50 tribes, 50 polities with land, leadership, and identities. We have lumped them all together under one term called Ohlone. So I like to remind people the word Ohlone is like the word European or African or Asian. It's a catch-all term to define a geography, if you will. It's not really a politically, it's not an ethnic group, it's not a tribe. It's a misnomer that we use today. So in the Bay Area here, we have used this word Ohlone to capture the people from Big Sur all the way over to Soledad, on up to the crest of the Diablo Range, to the Carquinez Straits, to San Francisco. So they're called altogether the Ohlone. Well, within that region are 7 distinct languages and 50 tribes, as I've mentioned. So all of that political, complexity and the complexity of people was unknown to the first Europeans who came. And when they arrived here, they could not put the people into a historic context because their own culture did not see time that way. People understood time through biblical time. There was no sense of deep time beyond what the textbooks, what their texts told them. So history as we know it is actually something we've learned more recently. And so when the Spanish first come, the first sailor up the coast is Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. That's only 20 years after Cortez conquers Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City, and continues the conquest westward and stumbles into the Pacific Ocean, which they name the Pacific, and begin their oceanic voyages around, finding the quick route to Asia and back, thus circumventing the Silk Road and creating a much more profitable economic opportunity by sailing directly there. And so it became important for Spain to control this new economy that they were developing. And so Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was ordered to sail north to look for ports, places where these transoceanic voyagers could stop to resupply themselves with water, firewood, green foods, because when these ships cross the Pacific Ocean, they're not in very good shape. You know, hygiene's not so great. Food, supplies, all those things, not so good. A foremast hand on a sailing ship has got no rights at all. Why would they even do the voyage, right? Well, because they could sock away a little spices or porcelains from Asia and make some, profit on the voyage. But the fatality rate was pretty high. So Cabrillo was sent north to explore. At that time, they thought California was an island because the Colorado River used to run wide and way inland before the Hoover Dam, took it out. So consequently, they thought California was an island. It was Cabrillo who figured out, after sailing around La Paz and Baja and going up the coast, that it was a larger landscape than they had thought. And so he continues north. He sails past up to the Santa Barbara Islands, the Channel Islands, where he meets one of the really complex culture groups in California called the Chumash. The Chumash had ocean-going canoes. They built plank canoes. And the only people in the Western Hemisphere who make plank canoes by stitching the boards together are Polynesians. And so we do believe there is a Polynesian contact in Santa Barbara around the 11th century, and maybe the 10th. About the same time, the Danes are on the other side in Canada. So forget Columbus. There were a lot of people here before him. But in any case, so when he arrives to Santa Barbara Channel Islands, there are thousands of native people on the islands because they have their boats to get them out there, and they're out in the ocean fishing for large marine mammals and sea fish. So they have a very sophisticated technology and lifestyle. And Cabrillo gets out of the ship with his flags. We claim this land for Spain, slips on the seaweed-covered rocks, breaks his arm, and later that will become gangrenous and kill him on the voyage. Not so good. But before it does, he sails past a harbor, just south of us here, with a point of land sticking out. He names the point of the sea wolves, Point Lobos, because he hears all the sea wolves barking. And he sees a bay he calls the Bay of the Pine Trees. Later, in 1602, a follow-up expedition under Sebastian Vizcaino will be the first to drop anchor on our California coast, and in that harbor of the Pines, which he renames Monterey, after the Viceroy of Mexico. And because he's feeling pretty chesty about being there, he decides to write it up. And he basically describes Monterey as a fabulous harbor, big enough to hold the imperial fleet of Spain. And so that sounds pretty good. Well, it's not really that great for square-rigged ships. It's pretty exposed. But hey, the word got back to Mexico. Everybody's pretty charged about that. There's a great harbor. Maybe that's a good place to set up shop for the sailing ships. But nothing happens. Not for 140 years. Nothing happens. And by the way, Vizcaino leaves Monterey on New Year's, sails past Año Nuevo, New Year's Point, and names it. I had to throw that in because I work in Año quite a bit. Anyhow, so they sail by, and he describes Monterey as a fabulous harbor, but nothing happens for quite a while, not until Imperial Russia starts coming down the coast, because they're harvesting fur seals and otters up in Alaska. They used to own Alaska, but we shouldn't tell them that right now. They're liable to annex it. Anyhow, so they're looking for a place to grow vegetables for their hunters in the far north, too. And so they're looking down the California coast to create a settlement. This spurs Imperial Spain to now want to colonize and move their game piece forward. By this time, they've already conquered, Arizona, New Mexico. They've reached all the way up into Kansas in some of their expeditions. Baja California is now settled as well over a period of time. But Upper California, or Alta California as they called it, was still unknown. We knew more about the surface of Mars than they knew about this place. And so when they realized the Spaniards are coming, or the Russians are coming, they decide it's time to colonize. So they send an expedition forth from Baja California under the command of Don Gaspar de Portola, who was a gentleman who bought his commission. In those days, people could buy their military positions. Doesn't necessarily mean they were the best for the job. I have his diary at home, and it's terrible. These are all bullet points when you want to really learn about what they saw. But fortunately, the expedition he organizes from the Presidio of Loreto in Baja also includes 2 diarists, Miguel Costanzo, who's an engineer. I wonder what an engineer does in those days, but at any rate. And Father Juan Crespi, who is one of the great diarists of our time, and his writings are wonderful. In those diaries, we get the first experiences of the land as they see it, and the encounters with the indigenous people. So very useful, although through their eyes, right? You still have to know how to filter what you're reading. So they set forth in 1769 to find the fabulous harbor of Monterey, and to also look for places to create settlements. They get past the Chumash land that Cabrillo had been in previously, and they are being hosted at every village they encounter. And the Chumash have villages of 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 people at a pop. And they got to go through all this ritual, and they show up, the head man makes them sit down, start eating foods. There's all this show going on, and they're hosting. It's the etiquette. And after they say, okay, we packed up, next day they leave, and then they hit another village, and they have to repeat the same scenario because that head man is going to, do them up. And so finally Crespi writes, we're now camping away from the Indians so that we can sleep at night. And I find that really charming, right? Because these are first encounters. There's no violence or avarice. It's just people meeting people at this point. That's not going to remain the case. But for this time, it is. And so the expedition comes forward. They get all the way to Monterey. By this time, they're out of supplies and materials. It's getting kind of dire. And they're supposed to meet a ship, which isn't there. It got blown all the way south to Panama. And so what to do? They decide Monterey must lie ahead. They don't realize they're there. So they continue hiking up the coast to get to Santa Cruz, and they talk about all the fields are burned. It's October 1769, and they're no longer encountering native people who are feeding them on the way. So they're kind of running out of choices. There's no food for the horses and mules because the land's all burned. What they don't know is the native people burn it every fall, as we will talk about shortly, because the people were managing this land. It was never a wilderness. It was a managed landscape, a gardened landscape. That's why there were 50 tribes. Each tribe is controlling its garden plot. And that's what defines territory, is how much land can you manage effectively. These are not nomadic people. These are residential, sedentary people. So they're managing their territories. And so they use fire as the tool for that. And so they can't feed their horses. They're heading up the coast. They get up to Rancho del Oso, where some of the soldiers are now sick and dying. And Father Crespi says, we can't go any further. They lay them out at the Park Visitor Center, and he administers supreme unction, last rites to some of these soldiers. This is the pinpoint of history for us, right? Because there they are going, what can we do? Crespi's writing about how they're eating the little green apples there, the manzanitas, which are vitamin C rich. And they don't know that, and they're probably suffering some scurvy. In any case, the next morning, it's a miracle. The soldiers are well, and Crespi writes, this is a miracle. And so they name the place La Salud, good health. And they continue down the beach at low tide and go up Año Nuevo Creek, and again, by the Parks Visitor Center. I work for Parks, I gotta say that. I'm retiring, but I'm still there. But in any case, so where a man is waiting for them, and he escorts them behind some low hills to a very large village. In the middle of a little valley behind Costanoa Lodge, they see a large dance house erected, big enough to hold 200 people. And they've wandered into the homeland of the Quiroste Nation. The Quiroste are one of the powerhouses in the Bay Area. And they control Pescadero, Año Nuevo, on up to Skyline. And that was their catchment area for all the resources they need. And Año Nuevo is a very productive landscape where terrestrial and marine habitats meet on a very large terrace, creating a very productive habitat for native people. In the Spanish mission records, they only use the word nation twice in the Bay Area. Once for the Quiroste, and the other for the Salchon. Those are the people of Crystal Springs on the other side of the hill here, down to the bay shore. They call them a nation too, which speaks to their social organization and authority. So, at any rate, the expedition comes forth. They go past the village at Año Nuevo they call La Casa Grande, the big house. And they are given foods and tobaccos. This is a great account near San Gregorio of the soldiers being offered bags of native tobacco because the people do use tobacco for prayer, not for recreation. But they smoke tobacco in these long tubular pipes. I'll show you a picture of one for prayer. The smoke going out to Esmen, the sun, is your visible body going out. And so they don't smoke for habit or abuse. They smoke for prayer. And so there's these great accounts of a community at San Gregorio exchanging tobacco with the Spaniards, because they have it too, right? And they invite the expeditioners into a circle where the head man produces a stone pipe, fills it full of tobacco, puts a glowing ember on top, blows the smoke to Esben. And they remark on that because they notice the dialect in Santa Cruz changes to a different language by Año Nuevo. We don't know what that is. But as soon as they get back to San Gregorio, they say, oh, they're once again speaking the Monterey language. It means there are words that are shared amongst different groups, but there's still enough distinctions between them as well. It gets very complicated. So at any rate, the Spaniards continue from Casa Grande. They get up to Half Moon Bay. There's an encounter with a village right here at Pilarcitos Creek. There were two large villages in this area of the Chiguan people. And they continue northward to Pacifica, where they send a group of hunters over the ridge to procure deer. And what do they see? San Francisco Bay. Now there's a world-class harbor. Bonus. And now they realize they've passed Monterey because they can see the Farallon Islands from their vantage point, which they know. And they can see Point Reyes to the north, which is what they called San Francisco at the time. So now they know they passed Monterey. And in the diaries, you're waiting for that magic moment where they say, oh, look at what we found. They don't. Instead, they go, well, we must have passed Monterey. and you know what? They're kind of happy about it because imagine that hike. You know, there's no, Velcro or Gore-Tex or lightweight, water bottles. These guys are hiking with leather and iron, and, it must be a grueling expedition if you think about it. It's a remarkable feat. And so they go all the way back to San Diego, and the ship is there. They meet the ship that they were supposed to meet in Monterey, and they realize, oh, we missed it. But royal orders are royal orders, so they try again. And in 1770, they make it to Monterey Peninsula, and they found the Royal Presidio of Monterey and California's second of 21 missions, Mission San Carlos de Borromeo. When I say Presidio, it's a ditch with a bunch of sticks poking out. The mission is a tule hut with an oak limb as an altar. So it's kind of tough going, right, from the start. Eventually, they start learning the inland route. Well, today's Highway 101. And then they begin to find quicker ways into San Francisco Bay. But at any rate, that's the way it goes. What I really wanted to say was that the Spaniards had no cultural context for deep time. And what they don't know that we know is that Native people have been here for a long time. In fact, archeologists are still pushing the clock back. Everybody wants to ask, when were the first people here? Well, all we can say is we have the oldest archeological dates, but those keep getting pushed back with new finds. So the oldest dates we have in San Francisco Bay Area are 12,000 years. We get older dates in Western America. Recently in New Mexico, footprints were found in mud that embedded organic materials. The organic material that was embedded in the footprint dated 23,000 years. And everybody's kind of going, wait a minute, because there is this kind of skepticism in archaeology. We're a pretty stodgy bunch, actually. But in any case, what that means is people have been here since the Ice Age. That is the Ice Age. And it was a different landscape because world sea level was 300 feet lower than it is now. That means the Farallon Islands, when first people came, were connected to the mainland. The ocean that you see offshore here was 3 miles further away. If you want to know what the original shoreline looked like for the first people, look on a map like National Geo makes that shows the bathymetric depths and draw a coastline at 300 feet. That was the coastline then. And what was on it? Well, San Francisco Bay looked like this. Before the bay was a bay, it was a valley. And on it were Columbian mammoths, broad-faced bear, bison antiguus, which is a much bigger bison than we have today, broad-faced bears, and horses and camels. Did you know that those are North American inventions? They went the other way, across the same land bridge that brought people into the Americas. When sea level is 300 feet lower, Alaska, Siberia are connected. Not for a little bit, for a long, long, long time. That means there was plenty of time for people to come over along with animals and to go back. It was not a one-way street. The moose comes in from Asia, fills out throughout North America. So things are moving around. So are people. We now know through DNA and genetics there are multiple migrations. It was complex from day one. And what we find is that there was also a coastal migration. Because we have sites in South America and Chile as old as the oldest in North America. How can that be? If it's a diffusion of small family groups, how can that be that they would be coeval and not far apart? Well, it's because of the multiple migrations. Now we know there was a coastal edge migration. That's a lineal course. And we know they did it with boats. And this is kind of the new thinking. So I'm sharing with you things that we're noodling over right now as professionals. Boats. People go, well, what kind of boats? Well, all you have to do is look at Eskimoan culture, and you can see the big umiaks. Those are big skin boats. They're made out of bone and hide. And so those are examples. So the DNA is showing us things about these migrations and multiple migrations. Native people are not one people. There are many different people. America is a composite of multiple communities of people. And in Asia, you have tribes in Siberia that are the most closely related to North American native people because they went both ways. So there's a thought, right? So we see the archaeology of Paleo-Indian culture, lack of a better word, by the tools. These are very large projectile plates with big flute scars down the middle, and they're specialist tools for one thing, hunting big honking animals. Like elephants. I was correct. I found a Columbian mammoth in Castroville amongst all the artichokes. That was pretty colorful. And, I'm not a paleontologist. So the first thing I said is, look, we found an elephant. Paleontologists go, they're not elephants. They're proboscideans. Like, okay. We got a woolly mammoth. No. They're not woolies. They're up north. They're Columbian mammoths. Who knew, right? Okay, Columbian mammoths. Fine, thank you. So we had Columbian mammoths, and we had mastodon, too. Those are leaf-eating, elephant-like creatures. And so they're coexisting. All of those guys are here, and these are the tools used to take them out. When those creatures stop existing, because they do disappear, so does the tools, because they're adapted. There are tools specifically for that function, right? So we do see, again, history and prehistory changes. So sea level starts to rise around 10,000 years ago when the climate changes. We enter a period called the early Holocene, followed by the middle Holocene, and we are in the late Holocene right now. For the past 3,000 years, we've been in the late Holocene, and that's changing too right now as climate warms up. But we've been warm before. From 7,000 years to 3,000 years ago was the middle Holocene, and we're heading back into it. That was a warmer time. The ice melts, sea rises, creating cataclysmic environmental changes, and the people are here throughout that whole thing, right? So those are the forces changing populations and movements, where people go. The Great Basin was once full of lakes and oak woodlands, very, very rich habitat. You go out there now and you're driving in Nevada going, oh my God, it's endless alkali flats, right? They're all lakes in their day. People were all around those places. So a lot of change in ancestral times. When sea level rises, it finally stabilizes just 4,000 years ago. My students roll their eyes. 4,000 years ago? That's a long time. No, it's not. We have literature from those days. We have the first epic flood stories, Gilgamesh from Sumeria. And you know what? That's what they all write about in, like in Egyptian texts and so forth. They're writing about environmental changes. In fact, a friend of mine thinks that the Sahara was actually the Garden of Eden. It's a metaphor for the drying up of the Sahara Desert. Sea level rose caused a lot of environmental change, and it takes a while for the habitats to stabilize. When habitats stabilize and native people get repetitive in their seasonal cycles, then the archaeology becomes visible, right? Because now you get repetitive use of a place. And what we find is that the Bay Area starts to inundate as the sea level creeps through the Golden Gate and starts to flood the interior valleys. And it takes a while for the habitat to gel, but once it does, it becomes highly productive. So we see the estuaries and sloughs develop full of fish, shellfish, birds, crabs, all these great food items. The Bay Area was, of course, one of the great flyways of the West. So the skies used to be literally darkened out by all the birds in flight. What that must have sounded like. You get this idea of the past being kind of quiet. I don't think it was. I think it was really a racket. Lots of animals, elk bugling, birds and flight and so forth. But once the environment stabilizes, then people begin to occupy places, and we start seeing the formation of large mounded sites throughout San Francisco Bay. Many people have asked me, why didn't the people, why weren't they more sophisticated? And that's kind of insulting, because they don't see pyramids or standing stones, and so everybody goes, well, that's not, high culture then. The fact of the matter is, San Francisco Bay once had quite a number of monumental mounds around it. In 1909, that's a cutaway of a shell mound. You see all the shell in there and all the dark soil. It's all charcoal from year after year after year of use, creating this very large mounded space. In 1909, after the University of California founded its Department of Anthropology, they surveyed the Bay Area, and this fellow named Nels Nelson mapped 425 mounded sites around the Bay Area. There are 6 left today. 6. Some of these mounds were quite large, like the Castro Mound in Mountain View
was 30 feet high,
as big as a football field. These are large mounded places, and they aren't shells just being discarded year after year like Super Bowl Sunday in the pistachio pile next to the TV tray. Heck no. These are created spaces. In fact, many of the mounds are made of earth, not shell. But they'll have shell in them because they host events on these mounds with, you have to feed your guests and so forth. These are large mounds. When I used to teach my courses on the origins of world civilizations, I was quick to point out that every ancient pyramid building society, whether it's Mayan, Egyptian, or a Sumerian ziggurat, they all started from an earlier tradition of building mounds. And so we see that same trajectory in the Bay Area. It just got truncated at a different time. Who knows where it would have gone? So all of the mounds were wiped out. This is the Emeryville Mound at the end of the Bay Bridge, where the Bay Bridge is now, as it's being bulldozed away. So what do we know, really, about the people when these major sites have been eliminated from our ability to look and understand them? So I convey that to you so that you get an idea that we are indeed talking about very complex societies, because you have to have a social order of leadership that now has people doing labor on an architectural project
rather than making food.
Or going out to do other tasks, right? So now you have to have leadership that can organize people to build a mound. So it speaks to the social complexity of the area. We did not know the names of all of the various tribes of the area of the region until a friend of mine named Randy Milliken made it his career to investigate them. He was a graduate at UC Berkeley. He did his master's and PhD on the mission records. He investigated all the mission records to identify what tribes were where, because the priests recorded the villages that the people came from. Randy Milliken was a good friend of mine. He passed away too early with a brain tumor. And when we lost him about 5 years ago, we lost a national treasure. Because he was the guy who got deep in the weeds learning about these things. So this is his map that we have to appreciate today. And what you can see, each one of these names
is a tribal polity
with its own territory and leadership. So where we are is the land of the Shiguan, or Shiguane, and it depends on how you pronounce it. We're not even sure. And then above us are the Puristak. That's Pacifica by the Sanchez Adobe was the village of Puristak. And then to the east, you have the Salchon. I mentioned them as a nation, Crystal Springs. And then below us at San Gregorio, you have the Cotagan. And then you have the Ohlone. Actually, the Cotagan are at Purisima, Tunitas Creek area, and which is a beautiful valley back in there. You can see that there would be villages in those places. And then, of course, the Carosti of Año Nuevo and so on, so forth. And on the base side, where the really big villages were, you have the Puichon of Mountain View, Tamien of San Jose, the Lamchin of Palo Alto. So you get the drift. It was a cosmopolitan landscape, much like we live in today. You can almost substitute today's city names for tribal names. Now, I like this map better that Randy did for the Monterey Bay region, because notice how he drew the boundaries, not edge to edge, because that's the way we think. The way they think is the landscapes that they manage. And so he's tried to convey that in this map to break our kind of lineal view of borders. People did not marry, men did not marry women in their village. They married outside of their village communities because it created alliance and trade networks. And women oftentimes brought their home language with them to the village. And we can see that through the mission baptismal records. The women's names have suffixes on the end that are regionally identifiable. So we can actually see who was marrying who at the mission time, through the women's names. So it's very fascinating. So Native people living in this cosmopolitan landscape built their houses every fall. Right about now would be the time you dig a circular pit and you frame it with willow rods and thatch it with tule. To make those willow rods means that you had to have pruned those willow trees years in advance so that they grow nice and straight for use later. And that's the kind of gardening we're talking about. You're always preparing the land and the plants for your tools in advance to be used later. So that requires a lot of foresight. So when you look at these reconstructed tule houses that I've seen, you kind of scratch your head and go, kind of small, And then I keep reading about how a house would typically have mom, dad, the kids, crazy Aunt Mildred, maybe somebody else too, and you're thinking, that's kind of small. Well, it's because we don't know how they all made their houses in the day. And so we get this kind of weird outlook. That house is nice, but way too small for a family. This is a picture of a Pomo house by Clear Lake. And notice that it's a photograph, not an artist's sketch. It's a photograph because it's not that long ago. And what you're looking at is a larger house to fit a family, which is why I use this picture. So these are what the houses looked like. They occupy them through the winter time, where they have their resources stored, particularly the acorns and granaries outside the house. And then in spring, they burn them down because they're looking to be hygienic. And so you rebuild fresh every year. And you also relocate villages, not far, far away. They're not nomadic, but you move maybe across the river or up the valley, for hygiene. So also because you can overexploit your firewoods, they're burning sticks mostly, not tree limbs, and you can quickly exhaust your fuel source that way as well. So there are a bunch of reasons why people relocate, but always within a very small territory. The average Ohlonian tribal territory is about 10 by 10 square miles. So people can spend their entire lives in those patches. And so we find that their building materials are used for many things. They built boats, tule boats, for going out in the bay. They used the reeds for houses. They gathered the pollens for food. They made duck decoys out of them because they float. You can make rope out of them, and baskets is kind of your must-have tool in a plant to have around. And if you leave water standing still long enough, it'll sprout tules. It's amazing around here. Hook and line fishing was also important for you coastal folks here. Seaweeds were also a big part of the diet. How do we know? Because it doesn't preserve. Because we get these little tiny mollusks that adapt to specific species of seaweed. And we find the mollusks in the archaeological site, too small for diet, but they come in with the seaweeds they eat. And so we can tell which seaweeds they're eating by the species of mollusks left behind, the snails that were on there. And so we know the seaweed was a big part of the diet, not surprisingly. They did do hook and line fishing offshore. Lots of fish to be had, lots of seabirds, and lots of pinnipeds, sea mammals to be had.
A very rich environment.
For coastal people. These are the typical shellfish spectrum for the coastal side. If you're looking at a Bay Area village, you'll see a different range of shellfish species because there are different species available along the bay muds.
But here, the dominant species is mussel shell.
So mussel shells are really important to the diet. Urchins, turban snails, not bad with a little butter and garlic, I might add. And then, of course, abalone, abalorio. That's a Monterey language word. Had to pick up. And so abalone was very important to Native people, not just for food, but for the badges they made from them, which I'll speak to in a little bit. Also important are these little shells on the bottom. See those little guys, the little snails? They're called Olivella snails. They have no dietary value whatsoever, but we find them in archaeological sites near and far because they are the raw material to make shell beads, and shell beads are money. These people had coin. We found an Olivella shell bead 5 meters below the surface of the ground in San Jose when we were building Highway 101 in 1980. Highway 101 did not connect until then. And it was my first archaeological endeavor. And 5 meters deep, that's pretty damn deep. You know, that's like 18, 20 feet below the surface in these little telephone booths. And we found a hearth. And in the hearth was charred rabbit bone and Olivella. Both came out 9,400 years old. That's just the end of the Ice Age. I have since worked on thousands of Olivella beads that I've studied from Mission Santa Clara, where they continued to be used till the 1840s, and they used iron needles to drill the holes by that time instead of stone drills. This is the oldest continuous coinage on the planet, as far as I can tell. So again, shell beads are labor intensive. They take a lot of work to make them. I'll talk more about that in a bit. So fishing, very important to the people. Stream fishing, ocean fishing, with baskets, with traps, with hooks, with harpoons. Sea otter, very important to the diet. I worked on a site near Fitzgerald Marine Reserve, which was just loaded with sea otter bone. And one thing we learned was that they weren't even after it for the meat at that point. They left all the skeletal material behind. They're really after them for the furs. So just to say, the people did go out in Thule boats to harvest them. I built a boat once. That's a story that would take an all evening because 5 hippies in a boat sailed it through San Francisco Bay, and we lived. It's now an exhibit at East Bay Regional Parks. Any case, I got a lot to say. I'm trying to write an article now on Thule boats and shell mounds in the bay. I think the shell mounds were ports because there was a lot of bay traffic in boats. That's another story. Okay. So hook and line fishing is what hook and line fishing looks like. They made hooks out of composite bone as well as shell. They make cobble weights with a groove pecked around them, and they use dogbane for cordage. Dogbane specifically because it's saltwater resistant. Very hard to find now. There's one last big patch I know of, and that's at the Filoli Estate. And California people, up until recently, were going there to gather dogbane still. It's getting hard to find. And they use it for a lot of things. These are fiber-based people. Archaeologically, these fibers don't preserve, nor does the basketry or the feather work or much of their material culture. So we're left with the stones, bones, and shells. And so you have to be very careful of the picture you paint of people based on those limited materials, right? But we do have native Californian people who persisted and
survived.
They can tell us a lot about their culture too. So hook and line fishing. We also find in the bayshore sites
with elk antler harpoons.
Those harpoons are about 1 foot long, and they use them in the sloughs with their Thule boats on a long pole, and they probe the bottoms of the mud flats, and they're trying to skewer stingrays and pull them out. And the evidence for that, besides the harpoon, are the stingray spines. These came from the Filoli Estate, just to bring it locally home. It's also important to know that they're harpooning things, including sea mammals. At Año Nuevo, we have great spectrums of the animals they hunted, and they hunted everything. Stellar sea lion, California sea lion, harbor seals, dolphins, even whales when they washed up were butchered. But there's one missing. One seal missing that everybody loves right now. The elephant seal, they are my nemesis. Elephant seals show up in Año Nuevo in the late 1950s. They were thought to be extinct in California until a breeding pair, 4 I think, were found off the Channel Islands. A breeding pair showed up at Año Nuevo from extinction, and that spurred the purchase of Año Nuevo as a marine reserve from the Steele family. I knew Catherine Steele when she was in her 90s. They were the first to settle that area in the American period, and were the last to leave. And so the elephant seal is actually proliferating now. We get about 2,000 pups a year, and they are like bulldozers on my archaeological sites. So that's why I have a particular bent about my friends, the elephant seals. I walk around them a lot. They're marvelous creatures, but they aren't doing the archaeology any good. And they're not in the diet. And the native people harvested pretty much everything they could. And so the archaeology deposits become great windows into past environments. If you want to know what kinds of habitats we're supposed to fix or manage, you got to look at the archaeology then, because that's the window of what was, and that's what you need to know. So
before the bow and arrow comes in.
The bow and arrow is actually a new invention. People are using what's called the atlatl, or the dart. It's an old world tradition. All of our ancestors used these, no matter where you're from. It comes over into the New World, and basically an atlatl is a rod with a hook that fits into a very large dart with a big stone point on the end. Basically a giant arrow, if you will, without the bow. And the rod gives you an extension of your arm so you can hurl that thing and bring down rather large animals.
And we find
the artifact assemblage mimics that. Most of the artifacts that people call arrowheads are not. They're almost always darts. An arrowhead, if you think about it, has to be pretty light and gracile. It has to weigh less than a nickel. And so most of the projectile points that people find and say, look at the arrowheads I found, are not, so you can change their outlooks when you talk to them. These are darts, and these are local darts from the Santa Cruz coast. And what's interesting is not only the forms, but the materials they're made out of. Because on the coast, we have Monterey chert at Año Nuevo. It's a black, white banded stone. But all these other stones, these colored stones, are coming from the Santa Clara Valley. And that's called Franciscan chert. The San Andreas Fault separates the two source materials. So archaeologically, I know who's going where. By the chipped stones they leave behind, it's like dye in the water. And I bring it up because around
1000 BC,
everything changes. All of a sudden, you have no more of those exotic points coming in. All you have are the local stuff, and these become the dominant point type, the spearheads, for quite a long time, until 1100 AD, when the bow and arrow shows up. Bow and arrow only shows up 900 years ago. For thousands and thousands of years, people are using these darts. So that's interesting. It kind of hits the philosophy, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, in other words, it worked. But then the darts come in.
And then the bow and arrow comes in and changes everything.
So these become the dominant style. What's going on here at 1000 BC? What's interesting about this is the fact that we don't have any of the exotic stones anymore. What's going on is that people are becoming circumscribed in their territories. You're looking at the reduction of mobility of people over large areas. As they become, population increases, they start to become territorial and defining their place. And consequently, you don't see the free gathering of materials that you did see earlier. Now things are bought and traded. The bow and arrow shows up around 1100 AD, as I mentioned, with a much more complicated toolkit. I just published an article on some arrowheads from Mission Santa Clara. We found 100 of them where the neophyte quarters were. In other words, the Indians at the mission were armed with lethal weapons. There's a story we hadn't seen before. And we're finding that there was a number of relationships at the missions. Any rate, I just published on those arrowheads. A number of them were made out of glass and porcelain as people adapted to the new materials at hand. Obsidian is, of course, a volcanic glass. They coveted that because it's exotic. There is no obsidian here. Obsidian only comes from where volcanoes are. And the nearest volcanic sources of obsidian to us, and by the way, we can trace it because each obsidian flow has its own chemical trace elements, and through a spectrograph, we can identify which source they come from, which is really cool because here in Half Moon Bay, you're at the edge of the world. Everything drops off, you know. And so we can see obsidians from many different sources here. And the primary sources are Clear Lake, Napa Valley, which I remind you is 2.5, 3 hours drive over a bridge, right? So there's some distance there. And the other source is Bodie and Glass Mountain, Casa Diablo. That's the other side of Yosemite in the Great Basin. So in prehistory, we have these very defined long-distance trade networks. And what do we find on the other end of that? Abalone shells and olivella beads. Those are the material things we can see. And we know that long-distance trade was a part of the culture. We have very few images of the people at the time of contact, but we do have some. This is a watercolor painting from a French artist named Louis Chary. He was on a voyage of exploration with the French. Remember, this is the days of Captain Cook and so forth. And they pull into San Francisco Bay, and Louis Chary, who's 21 years old, is a watercolor artist on board the ship. There was no cameras or Polaroids then, so you had artists drawing things. At any rate, at 21, he painted about a dozen images of the native people at Mission Dolores, San Francisco, of which this is one. And what's very important about this is that the bow is really cool. The bows are made of yew and covered with deer tendon, sinew. That gives them a very tight pull. I've read a Russian account from Fort Ross, because they did indeed build a colony up above the bay. In Fort Ross, they say the strongest among us could not pull one of these bows. So it gives you an idea of the biceps you might need to shoot one of these bows. I'm an archer, so I'm easily impressed. In any case, what you see here is these guys have silver fox quivers. They use silver fox for the quivers. Arrows take quite a bit of time to make because you have to coppice and prune the shrubs and get straight shoots a year, 2 years later for arrows. So you're constantly working on that. And what you notice, these guys aren't wearing any clothes. My students are quick to notice that. And that's because the men here generally didn't wear clothes. And it's because when you're living in a very small habitat, they're also managing the behavior of the herd animals. By spot burning near their villages, they get better browse that attracts the game they hunt. And they plan that. So you're getting the game animals to come to where you live. And if you're wearing like buckskins, like the Plains Indians and all that, that retains your human scent. These guys are not riding in on horseback with buffaloes. They have to live with the herds. And so what they do is they develop hunting strategies and behaviors so that they can hunt by acting like the animal, getting in very close to the herd, as I'll show you, and they select their targets, like a wolf does, to maintain the integrity of the herd, because that's their food base. It's like early livestock management in some ways, and one wonders, how does livestock management happen? Well, these are little clues kind of for us to understand how that might have happened in our ancestry too. So they're burning near the village so that they can harvest the animals close by. They develop strategies to support that. They don't want to shoot the alpha male of the herd because then the herd disperses and your neighbors benefit, not you. So these are all plans that have to be part of the daily strategy. So no clothing to retain the human scent. So we do know that the women tanned buckskin hides for aprons on the back, and they used deer brain to tan them. And the whiter the hide, that's the more marriable woman that you want, okay? These guys are pretty gender restricted. And they wear a plaited grass skirt, the women do in the front. Sometimes they will wear a cape of otter fur when it's very cold, but for most of the year, they're not wearing clothes, which means they have to have a high-fat diet. And things like fur seals meet that need in particular. We see a lot of fur seals at Año Nuevo as part of the diet, and also because they need the fat. It's a high-fat animal. So also acorns are high in fat and proteins, and so it's very important to maintain your metabolism because winter gets pretty cold. So for hunting, men would go through the sweats, the sauna, which is a church. It's where they pray. They keep the bows and arrows in the rafters in the upper part of the sweats to keep the human scent off of it. And they pray to take the life. And there's a lot more involved in that, but I got to get quick about it. And then when they're ready to hunt, men will put on the head of a deer and the hide, and they go into the herd. They know where the herd's going to be because they prep the land for it. And then they go in by behaving like the deer, targeting. I've read some Spanish accounts where they talk about how they almost shot the Indians thinking they were the deer because of their, emulating the animal. So they get very close, and they generally carry only 1 or 2 arrows because that's all you need. You don't get a 3rd or 4th shot. And so they get as close as they can. I've even heard, I don't know if the guy's bragging or what, where they take a bow and you kind of poke the animal, move them a little bit, and then you get a better shot. Well, what? So I think that these guys were pretty in tune with their terrain. And key to them were tule elk, pronghorn, and mule deer. There used to be a lot of tule elk around here. No more. You have to go to Point Reyes if you want to see herds of tule elk now. Or you can go up to Patrick's Point like this, where I was hiking through and suddenly realized I'm staring at a bunch of stags, and the females are on the other side of where I'm at, and it's like, that doesn't look good. Anyhow, I always tell my students, it's great that you record, yes, they hunted elk, blah, 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 right? Wait a minute. Put yourself in the shoes. If you've ever seen an elk, if you have, you're looking eye to eye with this guy, and you're going to jam him with a stick with a point on the end? How's that going to go over? So hunting can be kind of dangerous, right? And we forget that. We think, oh, yes, they hunted this, that, and the other. And you forget that it's a risky undertaking and, it can be catastrophic. People manage the land, as I've alluded to already. They burn the grasslands every fall. They also were selectively burning in the fern grottos to get better fern shoots for their basketry, the women for their basketry. They need proper tensility strength of their fibers. They are burning in the forests. They're burning in the grasslands. In the grasslands, they burn to keep the intrusive Doug fir and various other species out, because grassland is the hardest environment to manage, actually. And we know that in parks because we're busy trying to do just that. And when Big Basin went up, poof, we're looking at fire succession there, and we're getting rid of all the Doug firs because they come in like weeds and dominate the landscape pretty quickly. So you have to be aware of what fire does and its successions and what you might want to create afterwards, just as the people did. You get very large blooms of flowers, and the seeds from the flowers are edible as well, as they mill them between stones into to make a powder to eat. So hunting, through improving the browse for the animals is very important. By the way, that's Ishi. For those of you who don't know, Ishi came out of the mountains in 1911 for the first time. And I like to remind my students that we're not talking about distant times, because Ishi comes out of the mountains 19 years before my dad was born. Puts it in a perspective. So native California has seen some pretty abrupt changes in our lifetime. Any case, so bows and arrows. Animals of all types were hunted. Grizzly bear were common around here. I don't know if any of you have read about that, but some of the early Americans that settled in what was called Spanish Town, today's Half Moon Bay, talk about how they were afraid to go out at night because there were so many grizzly bears out there. There's a thought. How did that work with people? You got the fish drying rack there with all the salmon, your acorn granary. I've been raided by bears countless times in my camping experience with a cooler. How did it work when you've got a tule hut? We don't know. But what we suspect is it's even more dire than we thought, because we don't think the grizzly bears ever hibernated here. It's not cold enough for that. So you've got grizzly bear present all the time. And the name in the Ohlone words almost universally for them is Oresh. And there's a lot of villages with the name Oresh in it, Oresh Tak. tack means houses. And I've seen that name repeated quite a bit. In fact, there was a village called Tack at Woodside, nearby here, grizzly bear houses. So just so you know, grizzly bears were a presence on the land. I suspect that the native people improved certain berry patches and foods to attract the bears, put them over there, and while you're over here. A lot of the American settlers coming in talk about how the native men are lazy. They just sit around all the time while the women do all the work. I have a different picture. I can picture the women in the meadows gathering the seeds, as we know they did, where the grizzly bears are too. And you can imagine the men hanging around, keeping an eye on things, because somebody's got to keep an eye on things. We also know that the people had dogs, domestic dogs. That was a finding made just a few years ago on an archeological site in Palo Alto where we finally applied DNA because we find a lot of canid bones in the sites. Coyote, wolf, what? Well, it turned out they're domestic dogs. So that was a surprise. That's new knowledge for us. But you can imagine the utility of having a dog around the house with grizzly bears outside. So ducks, geese, quails, all part of the food. Seabirds, lots of seabirds. Along the coastal edge here, there used to be vernal pools before they were drained for agriculture. And those vernal pools attracted huge amounts of geese and waterfowl that would migrate through, adding to the food base that the people had here. But what's really productive is the valley floor, and that's why you will find about 6 people per square mile on the Peninsula coast, the bay side, and about 1.5 people per square mile on the coast side. So the coast side has a much older tradition, but the Bay Area on the inside of the bay shore is where things go poof and explode. And they explode because of the oak woodlands, which they referred to as oak orchards, because they're managing them. There used to be an oak woodland belt that ran all the way from Morgan Hill to San Carlos, and the Spanish called it the Way of the Trees. And Vancouver once took a horseback ride, the explorer George Vancouver, from Mission Dolores to Mission Santa Clara in about 1795 or so, and he stops in Mountain View and comments in his diary, "It looks like an English garden." And what he's referring to is that there's no understory because it's been burned. And he says the oak trees here are enormous. He says he measured one at 15 feet across at the trunk. All those oaks were managed because the women will burn underneath the oaks every year to remove the pests, keep it open, improves the recovery of the acorn, and it also improves the health of the tree. So they're actually facilitating the health of these trees. Of the various species of acorns available to native people, the valley oak looks pretty good because those big acorns, but it was the black oak that they really desired. They desired the black oak because they store the acorn in granaries through the sparse times of winter, and black oak doesn't mold, whereas the other acorns will. So there is a selection involved. At Castle Rock State Park, we're trying to cut down the Doug firs around there that have now encroached around the black oaks. In that park, we have bedrock mortars that speak to the ancient practice of milling acorn. And so our ecologists got smart with me and the cultural guys saying we could cross-pollinate our interests and call it a cultural landscape, which we did, and that landed them a huge grant, which allows them to cut the Doug fir back manually, because we have to do them one at a time, and encourage the black oaks to thrive again. So we see that the archaeology is not the bedrock mortar alone, it's the oaks and the mortar together. So the oak woodland becomes the most important habitat. Also the grasslands, because native California grasses had seed pods that were edible for people, and they harvested things, the grasses, the tarweeds, clarkia seeds. Those are very tiny seeds. And they milled them between flat stones, a hand stone and milling slab, to make a flour out of it. This is a picture of a woman up at Ukiah. I call it Ukiah because that's the proper name for that city. Ukiah, that's a lady who's gathering up tarweed seeds with beater baskets and getting them into a basket to collect to make into food. And again, it's a photograph, not an artist illustration, because this is about 1920. Just to put it in a perspective. So the people built acorn granaries near their houses for storing the acorns through the winter and milling them as needed. Acorns are labor intensive. They require a large toolkit to make them into food. They're toxic without proper processing. And so I'm going to walk you through this. And as I do, notice these baskets, the baskets and the designs on them, because the designs are not painted on. They're woven in with different fibers and plant materials, and they tell stories. California basketry is some of the finest on the planet. I just love looking at the design elements on baskets. In any case, you're looking at a basket of acorns on the left, a splitting stone in the middle, and the acorn meat on the right, being prepared for pounding in a mortar and pestle. In our landscapes in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we do find bedrock mortars, but we also get the portable bowl mortars as well. The one up there is called a flower pot mortar. Those are like the peak of the art of sculpture. Women are making these mortars by pecking boulders with a hard rock and milling them out. So they're very labor intensive. Those flower pot mortars are perfectly symmetrical all the way around. They're beautiful. Not common until after about 1600 AD. Then we start seeing more of those. And pestles, of course. All of these have to be shaped and created. So this is your Cuisinart for pounding things in. This is a woman from Los Banos showing how it's done, pounding acorns in a very deep mortar. Next step then is to take the flour and you have to leach it. This is also pictures of Yokuts women from Los Banos. And this woman is pounding the acorns. There's a soaproot brush there made out of the fibers of the soaproot to gather up the flour as it's pounded up. Also to clean baskets, there's a soaproot brush. It's still a tradition that's carried on today, making soaproot brushes. This is a sifting tray where you pound the acorn meal up. It looks like polenta. And then the next step is to put it in a sifting tray, shake it back and forth, separate the coarse particle from the fine. Coarse particles go back in the mortar because you're not going to feed your family lumpy acorn meal. And so the next step then is to leach it. To leach it requires putting a depression in the ground, lining it with leaves, and pouring water over it to take out the tannic acids. Generally hot water. To boil water is kind of a trick because the people did not have clay pots or metal. What happened was that the women wove baskets so tight, grass baskets, that when they were wet, they swelled and shut. And they would hold water in baskets. And they would drop white-hot glowing rocks into the basket, stirring it so it doesn't burn the basket, and boil water, which is what I'm going to show you in the next slide. But first, before I do that, I want to introduce Essie Parrish, who was the last Yamta, or holy woman of the Kashaya Pomo, who are the people of Fort Ross up the coast. When she passed away, when she was ill, she decided to court the anthropologists at Berkeley and teach. And it divided the tribe, because a lot of this knowledge is personal knowledge they don't want known. She didn't want it to be lost either. So she provided some lore for her children, who I've met, so that they would have things to teach in the future. But she took on the role as teacher for the anthropologists. And here she's building a very large acorn leaching pit. Look at the basket. These dark designs are probably maidenhair fern, just to give you an idea of material. If you know anything about maidenhair ferns, they're pretty fragile. In any case, the designs are beautiful. So she's preparing a pit. When she passed away, she was the last holy woman, the last dreamer. They called them Yamtas. She was buried in the dance house. They locked the door. It's still locked as we speak. She said, we're waiting for another dreamer. So when that person comes along, then they will open the door. And she passed away 1979 or so. I met her when I was very young. In any case, here you see the process of leaching acorn. You have the fire pit with the glowing rocks. You have pinchers made out of oak, and she's dipping the rock in the first basket to get rid of all the ash and stuff stuck to it. And then it's the second basket that will be the one used for the boiled water. And in this scene, this woman is ladling a basket of water out onto the acorn meal and puts a brush down to break the impact of the water so it doesn't slough out the acorn meal. So after repeated leachings, you end up with a kind of a mush. And A lot of people think that's the end of the story, but no, nobody eats acorn mush like that. You add things to it. You add insects, salt, food, whatever. It's your matrix, much like rice or potatoes. You know, you add things to it to make it a full meal. You can also bake it into a cake. But sometimes the acorn harvest fails. Then you go to plan B and try buckeyes. The problem with buckeyes, they're also toxic and have to be leached similarly. But the problem with buckeyes is, you ever seen dried apples when you've stored them too long? That's what happens to buckeyes too. So you need to eat them when you can. All the berries you can imagine were food. I just throw this in as a talking point. A lot of berries were gathered in abundance and then pounded in the mortar into a paste and sun-dried on rock. So you can get like a fruit roll-up out of that. Again, good use of food. They also harvested many bulb plants, particularly Brodia and soaproot, or soap lilies. I've been corrected. Botanists no longer call them soaproot. It's now soap lilies. And these are growing around the springtime. You see them all around the foothills. And women would harvest them with long digging sticks. They get a stick with a fire-hardened point. And sometimes they would build a socket, a stone on the end of it, a donut stone on the end, give it some push. And they push that in the ground and pry open the turf and pull out the bulb. It's not so easy. And they'll leave the little bulbs behind so that you have renewable crop. I think as they're aerating the soil, you create very concentrated gardens. I hike in these hills, and every once in a while, I find a concentrated patch of soaproot and Brodia still. And I'm pretty sure those are remnant gardens, you know, from the day. In any case, soaproot is toxic too. You have to cook it in an earth oven, luau style, for 36 hours to make it edible, which they did. It also has antibiotic qualities, and it's called soap lilies because if you pound it up, it makes a lather. You can use it as a hair wash. And if you pound it in still water streams and pools, it takes the oxygen out of the water, and the fish float up, and you can harvest them. So a very important plant for foods. They taste like sweet potatoes when they're cooked. They're pretty good. And, of course, the other foods we don't talk about a lot are the insects that were also harvested. As I mentioned, when I go to gatherings, sometimes you get a plate of food. You don't always get to pick what's on the plate. These are examples of that. And so what you're looking at are roasted grasshopper and shish kebab caterpillars. They're not bad, actually. I'm pretty squeamish. So I got to tell you. And as I tell all my lecturers and students, it's a cultural issue, isn't it? Next time you eat a shrimp, take a long look at that thing. You know? So anyhow, so there's lots of materials for basketry that has to be prepared in advance to make it useful, like these sedge plants. This is Kathleen Smith. She's a pomo basket weaver. And what she's doing is going through the sedge marshes and pulling the rhizomes out, laying them in nice and straight, and come back 3 years later for harvest for basket. That's how basketry works. It takes years to practice. And basketry in California is beautiful. The designs are astronomically complex. Women dream the designs. They start from the bottom and work their way out from a button. Different cultures start differently. There is cultural differences in the basketry of California. Basket experts can tell you where they're from by the style. I can do a lot of that myself too. Every household had to have an assemblage of baskets. You have your acorn cooking basket. Notice the designs on the inside too. It's strictly an expression of art. So this is for cooking the acorn in. There's sifting trays and seed beaters. Then you have storage baskets, and you have serving bowls. All of these are part of your household assemblage. In Ohlone country, there are only about 18 baskets that we know, and most of them are in Russia. They're in St. Petersburg at the Hermitage, their version of the Smithsonian. Because remember, the Russians were here to trade. They weren't conquering. And so they brought their Aleut harpooners out here from Eskimos. There was a time that Indians at Mission Santa Clara were surprised to see Eskimos in kayaks going up the Guadalupe River looking for otter, because the otters used to go up the rivers too in those days. So at any rate, we only have a few Ohlone baskets. This is one. And what you're looking at is a basket covered with wealth. It's got money on it because this is a dowry basket. It's for bride price. When a man marries into another family, you have to bring something to the table. And so high status people marry high status people. And they were class oriented. There are people with little money and those with lots. It's very familiar. And what you're looking at is a basket that used to be fluorescent red because they would take the pileated woodpecker or acorn woodpecker scalps, the down feathers that are vermilion red, and sew one in each stitch so that this basket was feathered. They used to take the top knot of quails, the plumes, and line the edges with them. This basket was on display at Santa Clara University some years ago. When I took this picture, it was on loan from the Smithsonian. And so the shells, those Olivella shells, are money. So you're looking at a money basket. So some friends of mine went to the Hermitage a few years ago to get permission to look at the Ohlone collection there. And of course, they give you very little time because they're very protective of it. So they got in and they only had a few hours after flying all the way to Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And what they did is they took photos. This is one of the baskets in Russia. And what you see are the shell beads and abalone pendants on it. Very beautiful. Here's another one. And from that, they were able to write a book on just the few hours they had. It's called Treasures from Native California, Altamira Press. You can buy it on Amazon. In any case, shell beads are money, as I said. They drilled them with stone-tip drills. And, boy, I got to watch the clock. And to make the beads, the first thing they would do is gather them up on the beach, which meant that the people on the beaches, like the Quirostia of Año Nuevo, our nation, were sitting on the bank. And they are indeed regulating the flow of these beads to the interior, where they're in great demand. And what we find is that the people on the coast did not value the drilled beads so much. They had plenty of the raw stuff. But what they did do is they harvested the Olivella when they wash up, and they bake them in ovens to burn them white, because money has to be uniform. And so after they bake them, then they can cut them into beads. As I mentioned, we found them at 9,400 years ago. So they are very old traditions in Native California culture and are still used today in ornament. So shell beads change in style through type, just like coins do. And we could date archaeological sites by the style of beads we find because we've radiocarbon dated the types. And they are uniform for periods of time in combinations, and then they change. And so, like coins, they do have their temporal affinities. And I'd like to show you these. These are rectangular beads from around 1100 AD, 900 to 1100 AD. And notice that they're rectangular, not circular. Those are not strung on necklaces. They're appliqued on a fabric, like sequins beads, and that's what we call them, sequins beads. So we have found them in position in the ground, but we don't have the fabric. So we don't know what they were sewn to. But they're very time sensitive, just to give you an example. Also, abalone pendants are not jewelry, they're badges. When you get pulled over by a cop, hopefully you don't, but if you do, you know who did because they're full of symbols. Their buttons have embossed things, they got a badge on, they got stripes. There's all kinds of symbols on these guys. That's what this is about. There are different societies in every village. In each society, people strove to be a member of a social group. And each society had responsibilities to host events and to perform in dance and ceremony. And so the emblems represent the organizations that sponsored it. And we also see change in fashion. These are from the Filoli estate above our hill here. And what you're looking at is bar scored, changing into diagonal ones there. It's a fashion shift. So we do see that in time in ancestral native culture. And some of the abalone pendants become quite beautiful, and we find them all the way over in Arizona, Nevada. These are being exchanged over long areas. This is my favorite assemblage. This is the hallmark of a religious movement that I believe starts in San Jose, because I found the oldest emblems of this ornament, which we call banjo pendants, or big head pendants, because they're associated with a tradition called kuksui, which is about the big head dancer. In kuksu tradition, you have an individual represent first person, and they put on an enormous headdress of rods radiating out with goose down feathers on the end, like a giant dandelion. And they have whistles and pendants all over. And this is the symbol associated with membership into the kuksu tradition. And this is a picture of the kuksu himself. I think it's one of the more fascinating pictures I could show you, because many of you are familiar with Plains Indians with the eagle feather bonnets and all that. That's a flash in the pan. That's only been around since they got the horse. This goes back to the dawn of time. And this is much, much older. And you're looking at a dancer who has, there's the ornament, there he is. He has elderberry clapper sticks in his hand. These are split sticks that you can clap together in your hand to make a rhythm. He has bird bone whistles around his neck. He's got abalone pendants. This guy's decked out. I have been in a dance house with these guys before. I was invited to a dance house called the Hesse up by Grinding Rock, inland from Reading, where the Nomlaki, Pomo, and Wintu dance. I was the only non-Indian there. I was invited by a friend named Sage LaPena, who took me to the dance after I was doing one of these slideshows. And I kept saying, they used to, and she stood up and said, we still do. And I went, oh, okay. And she invited me to go. And so I did. I drove all the way up there, big dance house with a tunnel going underneath. They look like cone-shaped structures. They're circular. You go down in, and there's a center pole, and there's tule mats all around the inside. And it's a church, and you have to comport yourself very properly. And in it comes the kuksu. He comes in tail first in the tunnel, and his headdress collapses. And when he comes in, it goes boing, sticks out. And I've danced with this guy like this far in front of me, and I still hear the music. And it was very powerful. Anyhow, this is a larger dance house in the Sierra foothills and in Grinding Rock State Park. State Parks manages this facility. The Miwoks still use it. They now no longer let non-native people in it. When I was younger, I did get to go into ceremony there. And if you want to go hang out, every September they have the acorn harvest festivals there. And the dance house is in use at the campground. And all the Paiutes come up from the valley to gamble at the stick games. And it's kind of interesting to watch those guys and the Miwok get together because they're two different traditions. The Paiutes are there to gamble. And these guys the Miwoks are there to put the world in balance, you know. And it's kind of, you see this little competition going on in the campground. It's kind of fun. At any rate, I've lost my shirt playing stick games. And these are what dancers look like. This is an anthropologist around the turn of the last century asking these guys to dress up in traditional outfits so he can study them, and they don't like it. They don't like it because it's illegal. Native American religions were outlawed in the United States until the Native American Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1976. Up until then, this was an illegal action. And so there's a lot of lore that we could have continued with if those kinds of actions had not occurred. So what you're looking at are people wearing feather aprons. There's hawk feathers sewn onto milkweed fiber nets. And they have flicker feather headbands, which I'll talk about more here, and bird bone whistles. There's some bird bone whistles from the Filoli estate. They made them out of eagle, condor, hawks, pelicans, egrets, you name it. And so bird bone whistles were part of ceremonial use. They have a very high-pitched sound. Sometimes they're glued together like pan I've seen those before. And they used ceanothus cocoon rattles. These are rattles from those really big moths. And they'll take out the larvae, put in pebbles in there, and dry them out. And this is also a rattle. It's just covered with feathers. And they're loud. They're loud like baby rattles. And so if you picture 100 dancers in a line with these rattles, with their bird bone whistles and the clapper sticks going, it creates quite a rhythm. And some of these dances, like the kuksu ceremony, goes on for 4 days. And these dancers have to be like Olympic athletes because it takes a lot out of them. And they're transforming themselves in the dance. In the dance house, when I was asked to dance, which was really weird, you know, I can't dance. Anyhow, I was asked to do that, and you're supposed to dance in place, stomping like this and rolling your arms. And the purpose is there's not enough room to do pirouettes in the dance house. But the idea is you're stomping in the ground because you're sending a message to the center pole, which is an antenna to the earth. And as you're stomping, it goes to the center pole, goes into the ground, and the earth retorts through your feet. And that's what makes you holy. So it's a process where there is no audience. Everyone is participant. So these are aprons. I know we're running out of time, and I'm long-winded. There's a lot to say. I'll try and speed it up. But if you can bear with me, I like this apron because not only is it covered with hawk feathers, where do you get that many hawk feathers to create an object? It means you've got to be collecting for quite a while. But if you flip over the apron, you notice the milkweed fiber has these red stitches in it. Well, no one sees that. And it's because in our world, we put on masks to be seen. But in their world, they're putting on the materials to become holy, to transform themselves. And there's formula to it. So it's not about performing to show someone. It's about performing properly in the formula you have to become that holy person. So it's a very different outlook. Flicker feathers made from the woodpeckers require that they take 2 tail feathers from each bird. That's a lot of birds. It takes about 1,700 quills to make one of these things, these bandoliers. Now this brings up a point. If this is the material that is what you need to symbolize your religion and your outlook, how can you maintain that? Where do you get that kind of quill, 1,700 flicker feathers now, right? And that is the problem. So these flicker feathers are used to make these bandoliers and are part of the regalia of dance throughout Central California. They're really beautiful, they're very valuable, and coming from him. And this is another Louis Chori painting of the people of San Francisco from here, from your peninsula. And what you're looking at is how faded it is, because remember those quills I showed you, and this watercolor is looking its age. In this picture, you see men that are painted red, vermilion red from the cinnabar from Mount Umunhum. Red paint was very important to them. And charcoal, they've got abalone pendants. It gives you an idea of how they looked. And we've also tried to reconstruct some of these images. For instance, at Año Nuevo, we established a 220-acre cultural preserve called the Caroste Valley Cultural Preserve, for the rediscovery of native tradition in terms of managing plants. And we've been working with the Ama Mutsun amongst some. We're also trying to outreach to other folks to join in our work there to learn how to rediscover plant management in these places for the tribes. So this is an artist's rendition of the big house at Casa Grande I mentioned earlier. And here you see some headdress and regalia. Hairnets were pretty common. People wore hairnets a lot. Many of the Spanish explorers were gifted hairnets as a token, and they speak about them. And magpie feather tops and deer bone awls, not only for making baskets, but also for holding your feather gear up on your head, and pins. They also made braided belts out of dog mane with feathers in them. These are tiny, tiny feathers and very tiny olivella beads. We don't have any of these. These belts are in the Museum of Man in Paris. And remember, the early American period was not about supporting native identity. Whereas the Europeans coming in were here to collect curiosities and things and put them in their museums. So that's why there are more Ohlone objects in Europe than there are here. And shamans, priests, and doctors are different classifications of specialists in Native society. Doctors were just that, herbalists, and they knew how to heal people. Priests were holy men, or women too. We read about women also being spiritually inclined. But sorcerers are another thing. Sorcerers you stay away from. They're powerful people. They go to powerful places. Places where they go is not open for everybody to go. Only specialists can go there. Or initiates, they would take young boys into special places and give them an infusion of datura, which is a hallucinogen. And as the 12-year-olds are in an altered state, they're getting all of society's morals downloaded on them by the holy man who is training them. And in their altered states, they see colors where mosquitoes are now eagles and so forth. But once they come out, they can no longer be boys. They're now men, and they're expected to behave as such. So there is a rites of passage kind of transformation for many of the societies, and they require the sorcerer to be involved. And those are dangerous people for native cultures. Tobacco pipes used for prayer, as I mentioned. There's some examples of tobacco pipes. Also, charm stones were used by shamans for healing. These are plummets that were sculpted out specifically for healing practices. In the Santa Cruz Mountains and all around California, we also find what are called cupule rocks. These are tiny depressions that were used for ceremonial purposes. When they peck the rock, they're actually after the powder for application. And the holes are just what's left over, basically. Paints, cinnabar, very important, bright red paint for ceremony coming from Mount Umunhum. And of course, ceremonial places abound on the landscape. But all this comes to a crashing halt with the advent of the first colonial settlement. In our case up here, it's Mission San Carlos and the Presidio in 1770. Then Mission San Francisco and the Presidio here in 1776. There's a year for you. And then Mission Santa Clara, 1777. And then there was another wave of missions 20 years later, and that would be Santa Cruz, San Jose, San Juan Bautista. There were 21 missions in California. The missions were built where the greatest Indian population densities were, because the idea was to take the native populations and make them the colonists of Spain using the feudal system that they knew in Europe, where you have an aristocracy, a middle class, and the peons. The peons would be your farmers and low-wage workers, and Spain was trying to emulate that tradition here. So they built the missions where the greatest population densities were, not the old myth that they built them one day's hiking distance apart. That's a myth I just heard recently, a week ago at Carmel, and they still say that. It's like, no, it has nothing to do with hiking one day apart. It's where the greatest populations were, because that's what they're trying to do, is colonize. In Ohlone country, think about this. There are 7 missions. That's 1/3 of all California missions are in Ohlone country, which speaks to you about the population density and the effects. For Native people in the missions, the two worlds were diametrically in opposite polar graphs. I use that picture to kind of emulate that point. The two are totally different. You get it. But it gets more complex when you start explaining things like religion to people who speak a completely different language and dream different dreams, have different symbols. In this case, you're looking at Chumash rock art that the holy men knew how to read. We can't. Here, you have a painting at Mission San Miguel that holy men know how to read. I have a hard time reading. And what you are seeing is the Archangel Gabriel with wings on his back, standing on the heads of babies. What? So it gives you an idea of sort of the complexity of the contacts and the relationships. And indeed, Native people succumbed to introduced diseases that they had no resistance to. They're being first contacts here. And we see that 90 to 95% of the Mission Indian population dies within the first 5 years of being brought in. And the population crash is so extreme and enormous that after a period, as the missions grow to become larger estates, they now also become supporting of the Presidio and the Pueblos, because they have all the land and they have all the labor. And so what happens is the mission people locally begin to be hammered. And that now causes the Presidio to rally troops and go to the interior, and they start hitting the villagers all over the Central Valley on up to the Sierra foothills. So that by the end of the Spanish period, with the advent of the Mexican Revolution, in 1822, the Republic of Mexico divests the mission lands and to private ownership, and that's when you start seeing the rancho periods. You hear about all the ranchos around here, Rancho Miramontes and so forth. That's the Mexican period, and now the new coin on the land is cattle, the hide and tallow trade. And the Native people who survived the missions are still here because they become the caballeros and the vaqueros. They become the cowboys. They survive, and they reorg, and they begin to recover. And all of this is going on during the Mexican period as Mexico breaks down the ownership of the mission properties through the law of secularization. Millions and millions of coastal acres are now open to settlement, to private ownership. Remember, it's a coastal phenomenon. It takes a while for them to go to the interior. One such individual was a guy named John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who gets a large land grant at what is now called Sacramento, builds a fort. Sutter's Fort is still a state park now. You can go visit in the middle of the valley. But these become the intrusions into the interior. And of course, the land changes forever with the livestock that roam wild. It's all about the hides and the tallow, not the meat. And so the cattle run wild, changing the landscape forever, so that the survivors of the missions can't even go back to a native lifeway because the native landscape is no longer what it was either. And so the people are still here. They become the labor. But one thing Mexico does that Spain did not do was to open its ports to foreign trade. And so we see American and British ships come in for the leather gear, the leather goods from the missions. That's the new industry that takes over. But Sutter decides to build a sawmill in the Sierra foothills. At the same time, there's a migration of Mormons out of Utah as they're being persecuted by the U.S. Army. And they spread over the Great Basin before the Donner Party and all those guys. And they come over the hills, and who do they go to? Sutter, the civilization that they knew. Sutter hires an American named John Marshall to build a sawmill along the American River. And he does. He creates a wheel-powered mill in the stream with a box that drives the water through the wheel. And the damn thing keeps getting jammed with gravel. So as he's cleaning out the gravel, what does he find? Gold. And what does he do? No, he tells everybody. It goes to Monterey, and it goes out to sea, and it becomes one of the greatest migrations of humans in history. In the year 1846, after the end of the Mexican-American War, there were about 5,800 Mexican citizens registered in California. 5,800. The first year of the gold rush, 100,000 miners show up. Second year, 200,000. There is no law, there is no government, there is no order. And the first thing they do is take over the ranches because that's where the fruit trees are. Then they launch towards the Sierras, and they begin an indiscriminate slaughter of Native Americans. And it becomes legally supported and reimbursable to bring in scalps of Native people, so that they start to create battalions of vigilantes to go after the Mariposa Battalion and such. California legislation, after we became a state in 1850, reimbursed in 1852 alone, vigilante groups reimbursed $1.1 million for the costs of their expeditions to exterminate Indians. It became not only legal, it was profitable. And so the California legislature then, as now, petitioned the federal government for reimbursement. So the feds pay the government, state government. And with that, they send troops to see that the administration of Indian affairs is going properly. And they create forts like Fort Tejon, Fort Cronkite, Fort Bragg, Round Valley Rancheria. And they round up the Indians to live on these rancherias, not reservations, because they sent 3 Indian commissioners to create reservations in 1852 under order of the president, President Polk, to create 18 reservations in California to put the Indians on them. And those who would not would be considered hostile and hunted. They took those 18 treaties back to Washington, and the California legislature was incensed about it and pressured the president not to ratify the treaties, and they weren't. Consequently, you see rancherias today as opposed to reservations, although there are a few. Those Indians that fought back with guns got reservations, like the Yurok and the Hoopa up in Northern California, for instance. Resistance is what created mutual respect, I guess. In any case, the slaughter of Native Californians is atrocious, it is genocidal, and is one of the more difficult things I have to teach when I teach, but is well documented because those perpetrating the slaughters were considered heroes and were very descriptive in their diaries, right down to the caliber of the guns they're using and how they did it, men, women, and children. So the fact that you don't see a lot of Native California around in your day-to-day life is partly attributable to these histories of oppression. That's difficult for me to speak of because I spend a lot of time with Native people. But it's something that most of us don't know unless you're told. So we see ballot measures coming up about casinos and gambling and such. I have nothing to say about that. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about. But I do want to say it is sort of amazing that we still get to vote on what they do. All right, that's it for my talk.